Okay. Okay, so give me a thumbs up again if you're looking at a PowerPoint presentation that's just like a title slide. Thumbs up, a yes. Okay, thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everybody. So let me pull up my notes and go ahead and get started. So yay, it's that time of year again. The Kentucky Arts Partnership grant application is open and ready for you to apply. And we will talk about this sort of, folks were invited who had never applied before. I recognize many of your names, and so you will get some repeat information, but I will also be talking about some things that are different to look out for if you have applied in the past. The main thing is that I did take a good concerted effort to look at this program and to go through and ask everybody who I needed to. Do we need to ask this question? Do we really have to have this document? And try to consolidate things as much as possible, get rid of redundancy, and really make sure that some of the things that we ask weren't just sort of vestiges from an era when we had to have something and then we didn't remember to stop asking for it, right? So that is one thing I did, and every year I would continue to try to do this for you and for me, frankly. So this is my contact information. If you don't have it already, I'll be honest, I am best to reach, especially about Kentucky Arts Partnership grant things, via email. The reason why is because we are still on a little bit of a hybrid working schedule where I'm in the office right now. I'm in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but Monday and Friday I do telecommute. I do have my office phones forwarded to my cell phone, but it's not always clear which is a business call and which is like somebody trying to sell me something. So I'll try to answer if I can. The other good thing about email for me is if you ask me a question, it gives me a time to sort of think of a really intentional and answer and consult the guidelines and really think about what you're asking me and formulate a good answer. It's also a good record of our conversation so that you can go back and reference it in case it comes up again. So I do prefer email, but obviously, you know, if you like calls, then I love them and I will take those as well. You can also schedule times to meet with me via Calendly, which is like this online portal where you can just schedule times with folks who don't have their own administrative assistant. So very general overview. Many of you are going to be familiar with this, but this is the intention of the grant. If it were up to me, there would be one question and a couple of uploads. Basically, we'd ask, why should the state and federal government give you money? You answer it, boom, check. However, we are accountable for these funds to the federal and state governments, and they ask us to have you demonstrate and go through a rigorous vetting and oversight process, even for these especially for these minimally restricted operating support funds. In the nonprofit field, you know, operate unrestricted or even minimally restricted operating support funds are hard to come by. Most people want you to do a project of some sort, and they put lots of caveats on the things that you can buy with that money. It is generally not for day-to-day operating expenses. And there are people in the field that they can be controversial at times. If, like me, you feel like that small amount of money that you get is not commensurate with the work that you have to do on this application to get it, don't blame the work. The work is irrefutable proof of your value to the Commonwealth. Please call the small sum of money to the attention of the people who can do something about it. So I always say, you know, if you have had to collect this data and write these narrative responses for this application, then copy and paste it into the text that you put in your legislative letters and make sure that those who authorize these funds understand your value and the value of the whole field, frankly. So the Arts Partnership is meant to support the day-to-day operating expenses of Kentucky arts and cultural organizations. Your primary mission does have to be to provide arts services. I know there are a lot of institutions around the state who have, maybe really strong arts programs within a larger nonprofit mission. Unfortunately, they're not eligible for this grant. And you do have to provide year-round arts programming. So for example, an entity that maybe does one large craft fair a year would not be eligible. Now, having said that, for those that we understand that in the arts, particularly in the performing arts, there are seasons, and therefore, you compacting your whole year into a season, still eligible. We can have some grace as long as you demonstrate that you do quite a lot within 12 months for the arts. And again, like I said, it's awarded through combined funding from the General Assembly and from the National Endowment for the Arts. Trying to advance the slide. Multiple monitors. There we go. So if I go too fast today, if you miss something, if you don't feel like taking notes, whatever, everything that I am about to tell you is going to be in the guidelines. They are extensive. They are the final word. All the dates, the rules, and the requirements are there, and they are informed by our commitment to the NEA and our cabinet legal. So they are pretty definite in that way. So, and this is just a little tidbit for the Gen Xers and the late millennials and the boomers in the room who remember Fast Times at Ridgemont High, in this famous scene where a young Judge Reinhardt encourages a young Sean Penn as Jeff Spicoli to know it, live it, love it. Then that's what I say about the guidelines. Read them front to back. So what's new in FY24? I imagine a lot of you are here for this reason. There are fewer narrative questions. I combined a lot of questions. There was a lot of redundancy in the questions. There were a lot of asking of questions that haven't been relevant for a few years, frankly. There is more clarification about what should be included in each narrative response. We are accused, and I think justly, of using a lot of jargon, both from the arts world and from what my friend calls the nonprofit industrial complex, things like capacity, delivery, value, and role. These mean different things in different spaces. And if you're not a grants writer, or if you're not an arts administrator, like most folks that come to this program might be, you may be a volunteer, a board member, an unpaid staff member, something like that. Then you're not necessarily not going to know what we mean within this context. So I've elaborated on each of those questions. There are fewer documents to upload, not many, but I was able to cross off a few of them by asking, do we use this? Why are we still asking for this? I literally never looked at this. Why are we asking people to find this? And then if you are an FY23 awardee, you know that this fiscal year, there is an interim report requirement that's due in January. The reason for that was this was a little bit of, it'll be very low barrier. It's just a couple of questions. It's basically a health check-in. So over the past few fiscal years, there was a lot of turnover. There was a lot of, sort of upheaval due to the pandemic. And we really felt like we needed to include an opportunity, at least this fiscal year, in order to check on everybody, just see if you've got a new executive director. How is the health of the organization? Are you experiencing recovery, or are you still suffering from a little bit of a little audience trepidation, what's going on with you? But we will not do that to you in fiscal year 24, because, the burden of having you do extra reporting is not worth, the check-in at this point in time, or at that point in time, a whole year from now, right? So for those of you who have applied before, it will feel mostly similar, except for those few things, and hopefully just a little bit less burdensome. Who may apply? Again, this is for the newcomers, but it's important. You have to be legally chartered in, headquartered in, and host your home season in Kentucky. This gets a little tricky around the border, around Cincinnati, Newport, Covington, especially. Communities are not always discreet. They have large borders. Unfortunately, our money, because it is meant to be spent and used in Kentucky, cannot cross those borders. Arts has to be your primary focus. As I said, it has to be part of your mission. It can't just be a program of something you do. You have to provide significant year-round arts activities. You have to be independent of any other organization, with the exception of 2 different instances. So local arts agencies that happen to be part of a city or county government unit, are able to apply. And then internal programs of academic institutions that serve, feature, and produce or present professional artists may apply. So that means not student programming, but like performing arts series, galleries, things like that. The caveat with that is only one program from one institution may apply. So not every professional arts program sponsored by the University of Kentucky can apply. They got to pick one to be the beneficiary. So then, of course, you have to have a current 501c3 IRS tax exempt status, or the equivalent for those entities that are a part of state government, a part of a municipal government. You have to have a board approved long-range plan of some sort. And then last but not least, you have to have a fiscally responsible review commensurate with your budget size. And we'll talk about what that means in just a minute. And that is not different at all from last year. So the program timeline. The application is due February 15th, 2023 at 11:59 p.m. The review of the applications will happen via panel in the month of May. We usually try to do 2 a week of those, and they are broken down into your tier size. So you will only be assessed amongst program of your similar budget size. And then the board will meet and approve those panel recommendations on June 16th, 2023. And then you will be notified officially as soon after they make that vote as possible. You can call me that afternoon if you want to know. You can sit in on that public board meeting if you really want to know. But you will receive a formal notification that includes an award letter and a grant agreement form as soon as we possibly can. Use of those grant funds may begin July 1st, 2023, because that is when fiscal year 24 begins. It has to conclude on June 30th, 2024, and then you owe me a report on July 30th, 2024. This calendar, of course, it has been a little bit in flux because of the pandemic, but this is roughly the same as it has been before that and will remain from now on. You can kind of bet on these times of year being when those things are going to be due. So things that you should know or have before you begin applying. You do have to, if you don't already, I should say, have a unique entity identifier. This is the UEI number or a Kentucky vendor code. You will need to apply for them immediately. Many of you already do. Instructions on how and where to apply for these numbers are in the guidelines. Both processes right now are pretty quick. Some of you all who have already applied for UEI probably experienced the delay and drama when they first implemented this, but the NEA requires all of our grantees to have the UEI. It's part of our compliance. It's if we are audited, not having these as a hand slappable offense or whatever punishment we would incur. And then the Kentucky vendor code is like a stitch in time. It's a small amount of trouble on the front end to apply for this, but it makes cutting your checks and making your electronic transfers a little easier later. It's like this, as opposed to a hassle and a struggle, and we have to have it now, essentially, for the treasury. So again, all of those things can be found in the guidelines. So the uploads that you're going to be needing, new this year, if you have done this application before, you know that in the past those uploads were all at the end. You just had to go through and upload about 15 different things all at once. I restructured the application so that the uploads are now within their relevant sections. So for example, you're now going to upload your current year's budget on the financial data page, right, where it belongs, and the cultural equity plan is going to be uploaded on the same page as your DEIA narrative response. This way the panelists can see those in context instead of them all being at the end. And it's not going to be more burdensome for you that way. It's just going to be another little required area on that page. If you don't have it, they'll let you know at the end to go back and put it in. So it's not, it's going to be better for the panelists, but it's not going to add any burden for you as the applicant. Some of these uploads you should have at the ready, and then some of them you'll have to create or ask for. Required for everyone is the IRS determination letter. Again, I am working on not having to collect this every single year. I think it's ridiculous to keep collecting an IRS determination letter from 1972 that's been valid since 1972 every year from the same organizations. I have multiple duplicated copies of IRS determination letters from longstanding CAP groups in a folder, and it's not like the letter has changed, and yet we have to collect it every year. So we'll see. I'll try to make headway on this at some point. The other thing you'll need is a board list, a list of your board members that includes, their name, location, and some other details. A staff list, all the folks, even if it's just one. Your current operating budget for fiscal year 23. And then again, I said I would mention this: an audit, a financial review, or statement. So we know, organizations, and I'm just going to go through and describe which one you will need based on your expenses. Organizations with prior year expenses of $500,000 or more must provide an audited financial statement performed by an independent CPA. Now, having said that, I understand that CPAs do not work on our time frame. And some of you all might be in the process of an audit right now, and it will not be available before your application is due. We have some grace for that. You can put in a earlier audit or a financial review and then give it to me later, and I will manually upload it. That is just one of those things. I see something in the chat. I'm going to open it. Verify that. Yeah. Angela, someday I hope to only have a verification box as well, and then be able to provide like a previous year's 501c3 as proof of that, rather than having to do it as an upload every single year. Until then, maybe, FY25, that will be the time. So organizations with prior year expenses of $250,499. No, wait, did I say that right? Between $259,000 to $499,999. Between that range, again, this is in the guidelines, must provide a financial review performed by an independent CPA. So it doesn't have to be a full audit, but it does have to be basically a balance sheet that has been approved by an external professional. Last but not least, organizations with prior year expenses of under $249,999 must provide an internally prepared balance sheet for us. Okay, so it's a financial review commensurate with your expenses. Then we need a long range or strategic plan. We need event information. So I realized that we asked this as an upload, but we didn't give a lot of clarification by what we mean by event information. It can be a compilation of flyers, web listing, a calendar of events, or just a word processing document with the title, the date, the time, attendance, etc. of events that you have had in the past year, just to give the panelists a sense of that you do have arts events year round, and that these are the nature of them and these are the types of attendance that you have. So that's what we mean by event information. And then an accessibility checklist. This is downloaded from the guidelines. Okay, so this is a document that you don't have to create. It's literally a checklist that you download and complete. It's in the guidelines and the portal, in fact. And it's based on the NEA's Design for Access document. I get this question a lot, especially with organizations or like, we don't have the same physical space. We present in a lot of different venues. I would say assess the physical access on the space that you are in or use the most. And just do your best on that. It's something that, again, is required by the NEA and that we have on file. And does kind of give you a guidepost for things that you can improve in things to look for too in venues that you're going to be working with in the future. So new last year was the cultural equity plan. And we know that still everyone is at a different place on this journey of making, perfecting, and working these plans. And you'll have an opportunity to explain where you are in this process and the narrative response. And then again, the plan and the response are going to be together this year. So they'll work together more and be in context better for the panelists. And I spent a lot of time in orientation talking to the panelists about this particular thing, because I do want them to understand that this is something where in scoring, they need to be meeting you where you are, or in this case, where you were a year ago. We want to know what kind of progress you've made if you are reapplying for a second year. So those are required for everyone. The ones that are required for some. So the first is membership organization. If you have a membership or subscribership program, we just need information about these programs. It can be, the area of, a screenshot of the area of your website where people apply to be members or apply for subscribership, and then a little bit of detail about how many folks you have taking advantage of these programs. And then an organizational chart. I realized last year how unfair it was to make this required. If you have an organization that has one unpaid volunteer staff person, they shouldn't have to upload a Word document with one person's name on it and call it an organizational chart. So this is only if you have more than one staff person. The idea being we need to know the hierarchy in your organization, who's doing what programs and who's responsible for what. And then the eligible revenue statement. This is new this year, but it has been included before. And let me explain this. We base your awards on your eligible revenue. And eligible revenue is your total revenue minus a couple of things that we don't want to see. If your total revenue figure from your balance sheet, from your audit, from your statement from your CPA is different from your eligible revenue, then we need to see this worksheet. Again, it is something that you download, just like the accessibility checklist. It will be in the guidelines and it will be in the portal. Many of you will not need to fool with this, because here are the things that are not considered eligible revenue and will need to be subtracted from your total revenue to tell us your eligible revenue figure. Those include in-kind contributions that have been assigned a cash value and added in as income revenue. I'm not talking about your in-kind contributions, period. I'm talking about if you have assigned a cash value to your in-kind contributions and then included them in your income or revenue, okay? Most people don't do this. There are some grant programs, particularly program grants, that will allow you to do this. We're not one of them because we don't require a match, okay? The second is donations to endowments. If you have an endowment, good for you. I wish that for everybody. But donations to endowments that are put directly into that endowment are not considered income or revenue, or eligible income or revenue. Capital funds for new construction. are not eligible revenue. And then last but not least, earnings from endowments that were withdrawn and not used for the expenditures in the period. In other words, you can't make a withdrawal from an endowment, leave it in your income or revenue in your balance, and use that as part of your eligible revenue, okay? Like I said, this implies you have an endowment, A, and B, that you drew on it recently, and that you left it in there and didn't use it to buy anything in that particular fiscal year, okay? These are, I won't say that they're rare circumstances, but they're certainly not something that every organization applying will have to deal with. If you have questions about this, they are likely going to be very specific to your organization, and I encourage you to email me specifically rather than do this in the chat, because this, if you are not somebody who as a finance person or used to looking at balance sheets, it can be intimidating to listen to conversations about it, frankly, and it really doesn't apply to a lot of folks. So, like I said, if your total revenue does not include any of these 4 things, then your total revenue and eligible revenue are one and the same. And you can omit this form altogether, not worry about it, skip it. And then again, the reason we do this is so that organizations don't artificially boost their income or revenue amounts with these types of assets or income or whatever monies in order to receive larger awards, okay? So it's to keep everybody on a fair playing field and not, award things that are considered ineligible. And then things that are not required but encouraged are, and those are going to be at the end per last year, are support materials like letters of support, promotional materials, any kind of media, good media reviews you've received, your annual report if you produce one or have one, and then we do have a field for work sample video URLs or other types of URLs. Frankly, you could put photographs in there too if you wanted to. It's just a text field that you add a web address to. So the GoSmart application portal, some do's and don'ts for returning applicants. Please do not create a new profile, because if you already have one, because we cannot consolidate them, you will just have multiple profiles. And then later on, some of you experienced this when we were collecting final reports for our pandemic relief funds. You will then have issues accessing your reporting forms, and it really puts a wrench in our reporting. Instead, if you've lost access to your password or username, maybe your predecessor didn't leave you with that information, or you have had a change in the email address that you want associated with that profile, call us. We can't reset passwords, but we can change almost everything else so that you can reset it yourself, essentially. If you do have access to that, do go ahead and get in your profile and make sure everything is up to date. Add your unique entity identifier if you haven't already. There is a new field for that in your profile. GoSmart added that for all of the people that they provide services for. And then do make sure that all of your addresses are current and up to date. And the reason for that is, especially you really want your addresses on your Kentucky vendor code profile, your application, and your grant agreement form to all match. And the reason why is that payment can be significantly delayed by discrepancies in addresses. The Treasury doesn't allow us to make payments to any person or entity that comes across as suspicious in this way, having 2 different addresses, and they'll just keep spitting our request back like an old dollar bill out of a vending machine. And so to avoid that, if you can make sure that all of your addresses are the same in all 3 of those areas, it will make things easier for both parties, you, me, and I guess all 3 parties, you, me, and the Treasury. If you are a new applicant, You'll simply go in, create a profile. You'll make sure it's an organization profile instead of an individual profile. You'll log in and click current programs and applications. That's true if you are an existing applicant. You're going to go in, log in, and click current programs and applications. And then you'll go scroll down to Kentucky Arts Partnership 2024 and click begin application. All right. And then you will be able to go in and edit it as needed until you finally click submit. Oops. Okay. So data that you are going to be asked about. So the initial questions in the application are almost all exclusively data. There's a couple of text areas, but they're usually explain this data in some way. They're not narrative responses. So, and many of them are mandated by the NEA. So we will be asking you about the people you serve, broken down by age groups, the artists you engage and employ by their demography, the people you serve by percentage within certain age groups, races and ethnicities, and other distinct groups like youth at risk and things like that. We ask about your number of paying attendees versus free attendees or patrons or participants or whatever you call them within your art form. We ask about seating at your venue and or wall space in a gallery, if those are relevant to you. We ask about your board demography and its process. For example, how are members of your board nominated or elected? How many times a year do you meet? Things like that. And then we ask about staff and volunteer numbers and demography. And then, of course, the other thing you're going to provide is your fiscal year 22 eligible revenue and some other financial information. And the narrative questions. So you won't find the questions significantly different, just fewer combined where they were redundant. And with more guidance about what's actually being asked. The topics have been renamed, reweighted to reflect, the current priorities too. And we kind of do that every year, depending on what the trends in the field are or the concerns are, from our authorizers. So again, each individual question is now going to have this list of suggested things to include in each response that offer clarification about the intention of that question and also give you pointers about where to get started in writing the response so you're not kind of flying blind. And the suggestions are phrased as shoulds by design, just to be a real semantician about it. They are things that if you're doing them, you should include. If you do not, you should be aspiring to include them at some application in the future or working toward them. So they're not musts necessarily. Don't feel like you have to fulfill every single one. It's if you can add that particular point to the question, then you should. Okay, so the 4 areas now are delivery, capacity, value and role of the arts, and then diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. So essentially we ask, how do you run your organization? How do you ensure artistic excellence? How do you make partnerships, get the word out, do data collection? And then we ask, how do you take care of the money you have? And how do you find ways to get more money, essentially? Then we ask, why are you important to your community? What role do you fill there, both as an arts organization and as just a good community partner? And then how do you articulate that value to the people that have money, frankly? And then last but not least, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. We ask how you are making efforts to build diversity both internally within your board, your volunteers, and your staff. And then how are you doing that externally through the services that you provide and the partnerships that you make? And I'm going to go through these a little bit more in depth for each of them. So delivery features 4 questions, 40 points total, right? And the first question is simply, describe how your organization plans and assesses its programs. And then under that, in the guidelines, you're going to see a list of things that, again, they're not musts, but should include in your response. Like when and how are programs planned? Who is involved in your planning process, including any relevant partners? How and by whom are decisions made? What are the criteria you use to ensure that your programs are high quality? How are artists included in your planning, particularly Kentucky artists? And then what are some of your strategies for measuring the success of your programs and who's involved in that assessment? So you will recognize these as bits and pieces of previous questions and previous applications that I have condensed into one smaller question. And then most of the questions are going to be phrased similarly. It's a very general topic, but there are lots of things that you can include if they are relevant to your organization. For example, we asked, describe your communication strategy in delivery. And within that, you should include things like how you distribute information about your programs. What's your marketing and branding look like? What are your strategies for that? How do you reach new or niche audiences? And then what are some of the partnerships that you have, like local media or tourism, that help you get this word out? So in addition to those 2 questions, this section also features a question about your education and outreach services, and one about how you evaluate the success of your delivery. And that talks about essentially your data collection and how you respond to what you see in that data. Capacity. So this is just 2 questions, 20 points total. The first one is pretty direct, and it doesn't really include any specific suggestions under it. We just want to know, what are your policies and procedures for ensuring your fiscal well-being and and what's your financial responsibility and your oversight look like? Now, the second question, describe your development strategy. Things you can include are, who are your consistent, reliable sources of funding? What are your efforts to obtain new sources of funding? What are your planned fundraising activities, like benefit events, or do you participate in any kind of gives days or membership drives, things like that? And then maybe include any relevant partnerships and relationships that support your development strategy. Okay, value and role of the arts is the most heavily weighted section this year. It's worth 30 points and it only has 2 questions. And the first one is, describe how the organization provides public value. Arguably, this is the most important question. This is the big why. This is the only question that I would ask if it were up to me, frankly, because it's, your reason for being. I suggest you could answer this question with the thought, if my organization were gone tomorrow for one reason or another, who would miss us and why? What hole would we leave in our local art scene, and how would it affect the community vitality if we weren't here? Now flip that negative thought into a positive one and answer this question that way. And some things that you can include are, how do you respond to the arts and non-arts needs through your programs and services? What are the partnerships that help maximize resources and fulfill those needs? Give us some specific, concrete examples of your impact on the community in areas like cultural enhancement, community identity, economic development, and all those other sectors that are important for a healthy community. Right, and then I'll talk about the advocacy question 2 here. The second question in that value and role of the arts, it just says, describe your arts organization's advocacy strategy. And it's arguably the hardest to answer So the should statements really do help here because they're pretty specific. So your response should include things like, how does your organization communicate regularly with local officials, especially state legislators? How do you involve public officials in your activities in a meaningful way? How does your staff and board stay informed about issues on public policy as they apply to arts and arts education? How does your organization talk about and share arts experiences with the people who can influence positive change? And then what are your relevant partnerships and memberships with local, state, and national groups that support your advocacy strategy? So for example, if you regularly engage with Kentuckians for the Arts, this is something that you should include in this question. Okay, and then diversity, equity, inclusion. It's just one question, 10 points. And we basically just ask, describe your efforts to build diversity within the organization and among program participants. You should definitely talk about your process for developing your cultural equity plan, including any notable progress. Maybe you're perfecting your plan, maybe you created it and you're taking a year to hone it. But you should definitely talk about that process and how you're being intentional on creating something that's useful and not just mandatory for compliance with this particular grant program, right? Any partnerships that you have that help fulfill your equity plan goals. Definitely include any internal activities that you've done to help grow cultural competency with your staff, board, and volunteers. This includes any training or facilitated conversations that you've taken part in, including some of the series that we've offered through the Arts Council. Talk about how you're going to promote diverse arts and cultures, and include, what are your program plans for inclusion? What are you doing to basically meet underserved population needs? And give us good, concrete, specific examples of programs that you've done that have been successful, that took your product to a broader audience. Again, you're going to recognize a lot of these things from what used to be multiple questions that are now condensed into one, with all of those things we wanted you to address within that one question. So those are the narrative questions. Here are some tips about working in the GoSmart portal. So as you're filling out the different pages, click Save Often. At the bottom of each page, there is a save feature. When I tell you, I was reviewing this fiscal year 24 application and putting in just sort of like filler text, like lorem ipsum text that's used for a publication, just to make sure the fields worked. And I got to the end and realized that I had not been clicking saved, had closed out of the application, and had lost everything. I have never empathized with you all more in that moment. So I always, and I didn't even follow my own good advice. I always tell people, do not write your responses in the application portal, do it in a word processor document, and then copy and paste it over. And still do that, but also click Save Often. So I jokingly call our online portal the Fisher-Price Grants portal, because it really doesn't allow us a lot of freedom in formatting. So in fact, a lot of those pages are mandatory and we can't edit it, like the NEA data questions. Like, it just automatically puts it in our application, no matter what the application is. But the good thing about it, its rudimentary nature, is that it also won't let you get into too much trouble. So things like that save feature are really good. But bad things are, there are times where we have to use a text field in order to collect number data. Basically, it's like you can either have a numbers page or a text page, not a combination. Which means we ask you, if you can, to just type numbers. If I ask you for a dollar amount, you don't need to include the currency symbol. If you're estimating, don't use the plus or minus signs to mean give or take, like say 25 plus, just say 25. And we'll understand that it's an estimate. So please try not to use any special characters in a field that asks you for numbers. That just makes it easier for us to tabulate and calculate later without having to do too much reformatting. Definitely use the "did I complete this page" function. So near the bottom of the page where the little save button is, there's also a little icon that says, "Did I complete this page?" And it will let you know before you get to the very end of the application if you have done everything that is required on that page. Sometimes you'll click that and it will tell you you're missing something that you know you did. Refresh it and then click it again, because sometimes it needs that in order to give you an accurate answer, I guess. In the upload areas, those little upload fields will allow you to use Word and Excel files. However, as a panelist, when you click on a PDF to open it, it just opens it in another browser page and it's very easy. If you click on a Word or Excel file, it makes you download it. And so if you can convert anything that you have that is another type of file to a PDF, and that will just make it so much easier on your panelists to be able to review your application. I know that puts the work and the onus on you, but then again, it also might mean that they feel a little bit, less annoyed when reviewing your application. So it might be worth the effort. And then last but not least, GoSmart takes a minute to fully submit. Okay, so do not wait until 11:59 p.m. on February 15th to submit your application, because it may be late just by the nature of the program. I would personally make your deadline 4 p.m. on that day, because that will ensure that there is always somebody in the office there to help you. But in the absence of being able to do that, then at least make your drop deadline 11:30 that day, and that will ensure that you go to bed with without it being heavy on your mind whether or not your application was submitted or not. Obviously, I'm not draconian about that. If something happens, I have some grace, but it just will be easier on everybody's mind if you don't submit at the literal last minute. So here are some basic just grant writing tips that I've noticed, especially from the panel reviews. I would say start your application immediately. Like, go into your profile and open your application immediately. That lets me know that you're going to apply, and I have a lay of the land. I can tell how big the field is going to be that year. However, don't start doing the application until you've read the entire set of guidelines, written your narrative responses in a word processor, and gotten all your uploads together. I think it's easier to go into this portal 2 or 3 times than it is to be working from it consistently, if that makes sense. And then don't make your panelists hunt for answers. Make sure you're putting the answer to the question under the appropriate heading or question. Don't make them find it elsewhere in the application. I know that having been a reviewer, even recently for the Vermont Arts Council, it's always very helpful. It doesn't come across as beautiful prose, but this is really about getting that information down and making it easy for them to assess and find. So do not use tentative language. As a panelist, they seem to respond better to, "We have firm plans to do this. We will do this," not that you hope to or wish to. So phrase what you are going to do in your upcoming fiscal year from a place of strength, that you actually have intention of getting it done, not that you wish or hope to. It seems like a little thing, but it just makes you sound like this is all possible, right? Rather than this is a dream. And then similarly, this is not a needs-based grant. This is a merit-based grant. You can totally be honest about your challenges, but make sure that you're not writing an invitation to a pity party. It will not have the effect that you think it does, especially post-pandemic. We want to hear what you are going to do in spite of the challenges that you're experiencing as an organization, not how badly you need this funding because you are a failing organization, right? It doesn't quite have the effect that you think it will on these panelists. I don't know if they're all just jaded or hard-hearted or what, but they would just rather hear it that way. Panelists come from across the country. I had one last year, or one single panel last year with a person from every United States time zone. So don't assume that they know the first thing about your community, okay? So make sure that you give them enough context to understand where you are and what your community looks like. It is a program administrator's job to be there to help. I really do want you to ask questions. I would rather answer these questions in the application phase and have you turn in a real strong application than have to catch these kinds of things in the technical review phase that have to do with eligibility, or have you be not sure and come down on the wrong side of the answer. Like I said, I do prefer email because it gives me time to process your questions better and give you a thought out response. But again, obviously, I'm going to take phone calls too. And I will try to have some open office hours throughout January too, like I did last year. And probably I'll do the same thing the night of the application so that you can just kind of like come onto a Zoom call if you're having some like last minute troubles, things like that. I'll try to make myself as available as possible. Edit and proofread. I do try to counsel the panelists about the elitism of being too finicky about grammar, punctuation, and the occasional typo. I realize not everyone is a grant writer, not everyone's a great writer, or even being paid to do this, frankly. And so I think it's just it's beside the point when they start bringing up things like that in a panel review. So I do coach them on that. However, do plan in time for a second set of eyes to look at your long text responses so that they're at least legible, right? I'll continue to coach the panel to be less snooty if you promise to proofread, and maybe we can all meet in the middle about that. Kentucky has 2 time zones. The deadline is 11:59 p.m. Eastern, period. I will not be offering extensions, neither individual nor mass. Having said that, if you email me the next day with a reasonable problem, obviously I'm going to work with you. If you email me 3 weeks later telling me about the stress or drama that you had and couldn't get your application in, there is nothing that I can do about that. But for those of you on the Central Time Zone, I feel for you. I went to school in Bowling Green. I was in exile in Central Time Zone too. I know what it's like to have to live your life on Eastern and lose an hour that way. But just be aware of it. And other than that, I think that's all I have to share about the application itself. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you all can ask questions. And I have a question from Joe. My organization, Asia Institute, due to controlling our cash flow, have changed from an audit to a financial review, right, with a CPA. The previous auditor dropped their auditing service for nonprofits. If our expenses are $576,000, does that require an audit, or can we use a review? Let me send you an email about that, or you send me an email asking the same question and I will respond to you individually. So I have noted, I don't know that this, I don't have enough data or anecdotes about this to make any sort of judgment, but it seems like since the pandemic, it has been difficult to get auditing services. I don't know if places have closed, have stopped doing nonprofit audits, things like that, because there was a lot of difficulty last year. There were several, and it may be the same organization, and that's the problem. It may be that there are just so few doing this for nonprofits to begin with. To have one close affects the whole field. So I will, let me know if you have a specific question about your specific expenses via an email, and we'll make a ruling. So, and unfortunately, at this point, there is no plans to change the expense level that we expect in an audit versus a review versus a statement, right? So it's one of those things that unfortunately is not up to me, but I will continue to ask every year because I do want to make sure that the expense of getting an audit is worth the effort of applying for this grant. However, I do know that it is a requirement for a lot of different organization and is considered to be a responsible fiscal activity for any organization receiving a certain amount of funding. So any other questions? And you don't have to do it in the chat. You can do it as with voice. And actually, I'll stop the recording now so that you won't feel like you're also part of the presentation.
Yeah, Sarah, just to